Dear Motorsport-Magazin.com friends and Formula One fans, you've been waiting for this video for a long time. They are finally here. The rules for the Formula One season 2026, a moderate revolution, as the FIA technical director Nicolas Tombazis put it so well. 2022, there the big revolution came on the chassis side. We will keep the ground effect cars, but they will be quite neutered. Why? I'll explain that in this video. It's been clear for quite some time now that there would be new engines. That's why Audi, among others, joins the Formula One. MGU-H is omitted, but everything else on the combustion engine side actually remains as before. The electrical component is significantly increased. We'll also talk a bit more about the engines in the video, I promise, but most of the things on the engine side had already been finalized. Now it was a matter of adapting the chassis rules accordingly, and that was a bit of a sticking point, because if you had just left the chassis rules as they were and just thrown the 2026 engine in there, that wouldn't have gone well. I'm sure you've heard the comments made by Max Verstappen. He said, "It was horrible. In Monza, you even had to shift down a gear on the long straight, the start-finish line. It was no longer Formula One-like. Verstappen even made his own future dependent on what Formula One would look like in the future." So there weren't particularly many positive voices. The FIA has always said, wait a minute. We already have solutions that will work fine with the 2026 engines as well. We can present these solutions to you now. On the one hand, the cars will be lighter. That was the request of the FIA president Mohammed bin Sulayem, but of course it was a wish of the drivers as well. The cars have become heavier and heavier in recent years. Now there is finally a roll backwards. However, the roll backwards is not quite as big as we had hoped. At least it will be 30 kilograms less. So 768 kilograms will be the minimum weight, although it may still change slightly due to tires and so on. But we're assuming 768 kilograms for now. How is this to be achieved? After all, lightweight design is already a very, very important topic. For one thing, the cars are getting a little narrower, so the dimensions have simply shrunk from 2 meters to 1.90 meters. The maximum wheelbase is currently 3.60 meters. This will be shortened to 3.40 meters. The floor will also be reduced a little. It will be 15 centimeters narrower. All of this means that the cars will be lighter, 30 kilograms. On the other hand, the cars will also produce significantly less downforce. The vehicles will lose around 30% downforce. At the same time, however, they will lose 55% aerodynamic drag, and that is a very, very important factor. Aerodynamic drag, when you have to manage energy, and from 2026 we will have to do that even more than we do now, because electrical energy is severely limited. So it's important that the aerodynamic drag is significantly lower than it is now, since otherwise the Formula One cars would become very, very slow on the straights. So that is one of the most important findings. 55% less aerodynamic drag and about 30% less downforce. Incidentally, this also means that there is naturally reduced load on the car. The suspension no longer has to be quite so massive. As a result, lightweight construction is moving more into focus once again. However, the 30% less downforce is not just a result of the slightly smaller dimensions. No, the regulations for the floor have also been tightened up. The floor is now partially flat again. The diffuser also becomes a little smaller so that the ground effect is no longer as strong. On the one hand, yes, air resistance, but the floor isn't significantly responsible for that. Nevertheless, the aim is to curb this a little. You've all noticed it. These very, very stiff vehicles, which Formula One cars are at the moment, are not necessarily drivers' favorites. And in order to become a little less dependent on them, the rules for the 2026 season have now taken a small step backwards at this point. The original intention was also to save weight through the tires by simply making them smaller again. 16-inch tires had been discussed for a long time. This change will not happen now. We are sticking with the 18-inch diameter tires, but they will be a little bit narrower. Visually, this may not be an absolute tidbit, but it is still within limits. 25 millimeters narrower on the front axle, 30 millimeters narrower on the rear axle, therefore around 8% narrower. That reduces air resistance as well as the weight of the cars, and that's why we went in this direction with the tires as well. Why not go even more extreme? Yes, there was also a bit of a fear that the issue with surface overheating would be even worse if the overall tire surface was smaller, so that's why they didn't dare to go that far. However, I would counter that with the 13-inch tires before 2022. It wasn't that much worse in terms of overheating than with the current vehicles that have the 18-inch tires. That's why I don't know if that's all 100% correct. But we'll certainly have a lot more discussions about that, not just about the tires, but about this direction that has been taken with the rules in general. Active aerodynamics. Yes, so far I've avoided this topic in the video. But, it's been on the agenda for a while regarding the 2026 vehicles, and it's actually coming. there will be a so-called Z mode and a so-called X mode. The Z mode is the mode with a lot of downforce but also significantly more drag. This will then always used in the corners, and the X mode will be used on the straights or on full throttle passages. What is especially important is that the active aerodynamics allows me to adjust the rear wing and to adjust the front wing. The original plan was to only adjust the rear wing. Then they realized, okay, that doesn't quite work with the balance of the car. This is why they now also allow active adjustment of the front wing. But why? You want to have even less drag on the straights, but then you still want to have a bit of downforce in the corners. That's why we now have these active aerodynamics. We've been familiar with them from production cars for a long time. Therefore, it's not really rocket science. The FIA says that the simulation and everything is so elaborate that we don't expect any problems. With DRS, we already have active aerodynamics to a certain extent. The drivers have to actively adjust it, and then they can either undo it manually or the rear wing is steepened again when the brakes are applied. It will be exactly like that in the future. There are predefined zones. These don't just have to be straights, but can be full throttle passages as well, in which the drivers can then activate. This active aerodynamics have little drag, are fast, and then either manually return to Z mode or apply the brakes. It is very important at this point that we are not talking about an overtaking aid here. This means while DRS can only be used in the race if you are within 1 second of the car in front in predefined zones, the zones will also be predefined for active aerodynamics. But every driver can use them at any time. In other words, you don't have to be behind the car in front. No, you can always do that. The sporting regulations can perhaps be adapted a little so that it is perhaps restricted in the rain, as with DRS. But basically, you can always use it. There is a 3-part rear wing for this. Anyway, the beam wing will be history. It only returned in 2022. You may have already seen the front wing in the pictures. It looks a little different. It's 10 centimeters narrower than before. In my opinion, that's a big step forward visually. As a result, we also have an in-wash concept again. This means that the air is directed past the wheels on the inside and not on the outside. This in turn is very, very important for overtaking, because we always talk a lot about dirty air. That was one of the aims of the 2022 rules, to avoid or at least reduce dirty air. The goal has, well, more or less been worked out. You can see that things are now getting worse again with the development 2026. Are there plans to take further steps? They've realized, okay, there are flaws in the current system, which is why it's going further and further in the direction of outwash again. More and more dirty air, more and more vulnerable. Of course, that still exists in 2026. You can't predict what the teams will develop. But they have recognized mistakes and have now introduced more standard components in certain places. The front wing has been reduced in size, and they've also gone for an in-wash. The wheel arches plans are history, by the way. Yes, and then I'm curious to see how it will all look in practice. In practice, now that's a wonderful transition again today. Practice is also such a nice print magazine. By the way, you can no longer order this one. This has long been sold out. So if you want the next issue, go to abo.motorsport-magazin.com, where you can pre-order issue 97, or you can also give your loved ones a gift voucher. For example, as a souvenir for a barbecue party instead of a crate of beer or a bottle of wine. Motorsport Magazine print subscription. That's the practice. Now back to the theory. If there are already active aerodynamics either way, how is it possible to overtake? Is the dirty air, is the outwash so little that you can overtake in the conventional way again? Nobody is actually assuming that. What's more, we mustn't forget that if the air resistance is reduced by 55%, then the slipstream effect is naturally also correspondingly small. We've already seen that with the current cars. Yes, but will we then see a race like Monaco 24 times? That shouldn't happen, but instead of an aerodynamic overtaking aid, there is now an engine overtaking aid. I think it's almost a bit nicer. More power, that's easier to imagine, but even there it gets complicated. I already said at the beginning of the video that the engines have been fixed for some time, that they are very similar to the current units. 1.6 liter turbo, one large turbocharger. The MGU-H, that is the electrification of the turbocharger, is gone. The MGU-K remains, but the MGU-K becomes significantly stronger from 120 kilowatts to 350 kilowatts. 350 kilowatts instead of 120 kilowatts sounds super cool at first. More power, but the combustion side is winded down in return. The whole thing is done via the fuel flow, which decreases. It is expected that the engine power will drop from 550 kilowatts to 400 kilowatts in the combustion engine. That's still 150 HP and change more perhaps, but we have a big problem. the energy balance. This is already the case on the combustion side. We still have a very high proportion of combustion engines. When the proportion of combustion engines decreases in 2026, we will have to rely more on electric power. But you don't have that permanently available. You only have a limited energy storage capacity, which remains at 4 megajoules, so the energy remains the same. More recuperation is allowed, which means the battery has to be charged and discharged several times during one lap. But even that has its limits, of course, and that's why we went in this direction. It has been said that you need significantly less drag because otherwise the speed profiles, as Max Verstappen feared, will not be Formula One-like. Then you will reach the maximum speed relatively early because you naturally spend the energy at the beginning of the straight when accelerating in order to optimize lap time, and then it gets very, very tight out of the back. And that's why they said, okay, first of all, we need chassis rules that prevent all this. That's why we now have active aerodynamics, less drag, and so on. And then we also need something for overtaking, and that's exactly why we now have the so-called override mode. So you all know overtake mode, where you can simply mobilize the last forces of the engine and the battery within the framework of the regulations, obviously. That remains the case. But then there's also an override mode, which kind of literally overrides the regulations, if you like, because the regulations specify exactly how much power the MGU-K is allowed to output. The MGU-K mustn't permanently output 350 kilowatts. On the one hand, a safety mechanism has been introduced to ensure that this MGU-K power is not reduced too quickly. There are also different distance categories. With over 3,500 meters at full throttle, the energy can be reduced a little more slowly. It's incredibly complicated. Incidentally, we have already published an article on our website on this topic. If you are interested in this in more detail, you are welcome to read it again. But now back to the overtaking aid. The MGU-K may only output the full 350 kilowatts up to 290 kilometers per hour. Then the output of the MGU-K is gradually reduced. Why? Because the aim is to create an overtaking aid. In override mode, the MGU-K only cuts back at 337 kilometers per hour. This means that when I am in override mode, I can retrieve MGU-K power for much longer than in normal mode. As a result, the driver behind the system will be very similar to DRS. The sporting regulations will then have to determine who is allowed to use the override and when. The driver behind will have more energy available from a certain point on the straight, meaning when he reaches over 290 kilometers per hour. Of course, it also has the advantage that it is a bit more strategic than DRS, because DRS, the driver behind has it, opens it, and the driver in front does not. The driver behind may now have more power at his disposal, but he still needs to manage things better because the energy doesn't grow on trees or come from anywhere. Nevertheless, there is still a little help. Since a few amendments have been made to the regulations, originally 9 megajoules were to be recuperated per lap, but this has now been reduced to 8.5 megajoules. Why? Because there is still half a megajoule of room for this override mode. The driver behind is then allowed to recuperate half a megajoule more per lap so that he doesn't run out of energy to overtake at the end, but of course he still has to manage accordingly. So, incredibly complicated. I hope I've been able to get it across reasonably clearly now. As I said, we've also explained the whole thing in the article on our website, Motorsport-Magazin.com, including graphs and so on. You can indulge in the details there. So, for now, chassis, engine, overtaking. What are we still missing? Safety, of course. Safety is always a big issue in Formula One, and also a reason why the cars are currently as heavy as they are. Yes, the engines play a big part in this matter, but so does safety. And further improvements are being made to the front impact structure. That's actually the nose of the car, if you look at it like that. The nose is actually a crash zone, a crash box. However, it has been found that, yes, it works quite well in and of itself if you hit it somewhere, but the problem is that it bends very quickly and then the entire front structure is gone. And if you then have an impact, you're basically no longer protected. That's why it will now be a two-stage structure so that the driver is even better protected in the event of a second impact. At the same time, of course, the forces will be raised a little so that they can withstand even more. There are also the intrusion panels, which are the silo panels that are fitted around the monocoque so that the monocoque is not penetrated by any components or parts. The whole thing is being adapted and made even more resilient, especially around the fuel tank. And the FIA is very proud of the fact that significant improvements have been made in terms of safety, while at the same time keeping the weight down. There have already been a few changes to the roll bar in the last 2 years following the terrible accident of Guan Yu Zhou at Silverstone 2 years ago. The whole thing will be increased from 16 to 20 G-forces. And another very interesting topic, lights on the rear wing have also been in use since the 2022 season. They are now being significantly reinforced again, so it is hoped that this will perhaps improve visibility in the rain, because the spray guards, as the tests have shown, are not an aid. They are now being shelved for the time being, and then it is hoped that this will perhaps improve the whole thing a little. That's it for this topic for now, but we're looking forward to a press conference with Nicolas Tombazis at this Grand Prix weekend, where he'll reveal even more details about the regulations for 2026. It's also about the cost cap. This is now the second set of regulations to take place under the cost cap. I'm curious to see whether this will change anything. Incidentally, aerodynamic development is only allowed from 2025. That has been clear for some time now. So there are many topics that we still have to discuss, going into much more detail. Nicolas Tombazis will help us with this, but we will also be dealing with the reactions of the drivers and the team bosses over the next few days. And if you don't want to miss them, then Motorsport-Magazin.com is an absolute necessity. Either type it into your browser or get the app. It's free for Android and iOS, and you'll get all the news straight away. Just like for the Formula One race weekend in Canada, of course.